Inject some politics into your role-playing games. Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. Lee Rimmer posted a video on the RPG Brigade on Facebook about, his title was, Keep Your Personal Politics Out of My Role-Playing Games, a clickbait title. So I thought I'd respond about injecting politics into your role-playing games and give perspective of what I have done. I have injected a lot of politics into my role-playing games. A lot. People may not even realize how much I've injected. But the people say, oh, I don't like politics in my role-playing games. But I go, or I don't like politics in my fantasy. And I go, that's absolutely not true. One of the most popular television shows out there right now is Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones is pure politics. For those of you who don't know, Game of Thrones is George R.R. Martin's take on the War of the Roses. He said that. The War of the Roses is a battle in England. It was a civil war over who would become king, because there was no one in there. And we get a lot of phrases. We hear the term Kingmaker today, and we don't realize that that comes back from the War of the Roses, which it was not called at that time. It was just a civil war. Today we recognize that the two different houses, one had the white rose, one had the red rose in their sigils, but that wasn't what they were known for. But historians came up with the phrase War of the Roses. And maybe my knowledge of English history is a little bit fuzzy, and I didn't check any of this. This is just from memory. But I've got a game up on the wall over here called Kingmaker, which put out by Avalon Hill, which is absolutely fun. It's a fun board game about who becomes king, because you have your forces. You want to capture a king, and you have to get him to some place where you can crown him. And there's a bunch of politics in that game, because that's what it's about. People don't recognize that politics is about what kind of government you have. And we have interesting challenges in this. I mean, we had shall we say, a contested election recently, and maybe you don't want to put that politics in there, but the fact of the type of government is politics. We have sort of a fascination with kings and dukes and lords and such, but you have to understand, if you're an American, we're not supposed to be respecters of titles. And we don't respect titles of other countries. We're not supposed to. But what happens is that we do, but we're interested about the royal titles and who's dating who and who's next in line and that whole line of succession. But if you go back in history, not that many hundreds of years ago, you realize that it really gets interesting. That's why some of my favorite movies, The Lion in Winter, the idea that the oldest son is automatically inherits by order of birth was not set in the 1100s, 1100, 1200, because that's why the play and the true story about Henry II is that his Henry III, his oldest son, he had chosen to be his heir, had died, but he had 3 other sons, and it was up in the air who was going to be the next king, because it wasn't always the next one in line. It was up to the king to decide who would follow him when he died. It wasn't by order of birth. That's a modern convention. So if you go back in ancient history, you have this whole interesting question of who succeeds who and how do they come to power and so on. And if we go back to like ancient Rome, you get into interesting inheritance laws and so on. That was the whole plot of Cleopatra with Mark Antony and Caesar, and you have all of that's politics, putting that in there. You bring in the Three Musketeers. were you follower of the king or a follower of the queen? Because they were battling each other. So you get into that's all politics that you can put into your game. And, I don't see any or hardly any games that really set up about a democracy running the thing, because democracies tend to get, shall we say, boring. They're not as interesting nor as fast moving as monarchies and despots and dictators and so on. And for role-playing games, you normally have some sort of monarchy. Let's be honest, that's the majority of the role-playing games you run into are that, and that you've got monarchy. You even run into those in modern settings and so on. What kind of rulership do you have in your kingdom or your country or whatever? Maybe Traveler would be one that would be a little bit different, where you may have a bunch of other different kinds of governments. But again, that's politics. How do people get things done? How, is there military? Is there taxes? Is there a police force? All of that is politics. In the world of Tiglath, I had, the interesting question. Do you believe in the draft? I'm old enough that I missed the draft, and I never went to Vietnam. I'm not that old, but what happens is that the draft. I had a draft card. I may actually no. I think I may actually have that someplace. I'm not sure, but I did have a draft card. I was, but it was I was issued one, but that's sort of a collector's item now days. But what happens is that the draft was military, and people, did you honor the draft, or did you run away to Canada or other places? That's an interesting question. In the world of Tiglath, you were called up. The entire country went through. They knew they were going to be invaded, but they didn't respond fast enough, and they pulled up everybody and drafted everyone they could to prepare for an incoming invasion. Which in the world of Tiglath, they lost. The Marzar came in and slaughtered the standing army and slaughtered the royal family. They actually skinned the royal family alive. They actually filleted them. They killed all the royal family, and they slaughtered the military. And they were now the ultimate force in the country. What was left of the country, the occupied territory. So you run into that. I was patterning that after one of the ideas I wanted was the example of after the Syracuse expedition by the Athenians, where they sent off their military and it was just literally slaughtered and hardly anybody came back. And how that affected them, because they lost all their young people. They lost a generation. Almost everyone at that age was there, and that was one of the ideas I was trying to introduce, because I wanted to set that mood of despair in the campaign. So you can introduce a whole bunch of different things of politics into your campaign, and you're doing it anyway. If you've established any form of government, or even if you think about that, if you declare it's all anarchy, that's politics, because that's how are things running? Who's in charge? That's politics. So you're injecting politics into your role-playing games no matter what. You may not just think of it that way, but it really is. I also injected what is your level of licensure and so on in the world of Tiglath, because it was the country of Grath was very heavily licensed. A farmer had to have a license to determine what kind of crops he could plant, and he had to have another license to actually harvest them, and yet another license to sell them. And then if he wanted to sell them, then they could only be sold to people who had the license to buy them. And in essence, there was a lot of graft to grease the wheels to be able to do anything. And the Marzar, when they came in, who were the occupying army, they they couldn't even understand this. This was beyond their comprehension. They had never seen anything like this, and they just executed a bunch of people. If the people got in their way, they just executed them. It was that was an interesting, my take on some politics about regulations. And yes, I injected some of that. That was politics that I injected in, but I wanted to give a feel for the country, of how the country worked and how things were going. So yes, I've injected a lot of politics in my campaigns. In all of them that I've run. I did the World of Amoras, which was there was the sex slave trade, which has some very interesting politics about sex and very interesting politics about slavery. So all of those are politics. So you've got politics in your campaign if you're reporting to anyone. I beg to find someone who would give me a game, a role-playing game, where there's more than one player, where there's not politics. By definition, you have to have some sort of government, some non-player characters that are in power or so on. So there is politics in there. You may not recognize it, you may not be playing it as such, but there is at least some politics. Is there a ruler of the city? Is there some hierarchical of who's running it? Or even if there isn't, if it's just total anarchy, that's a form of politics. Talk to the anarchists, the people who believe that we shouldn't have any kind of government or so on. All of that is politics. You may not recognize it, but it's there. So I just say be open about it. Pick what kind of politics you want to put into your campaign. Maybe they're the politics that you agree with, or maybe they're the politics you despise. For example, pick someone that you don't, I'm not going to pick the classic one of from World War II. I'll leave that one to your imagination. But you could pick somebody else. You could pick Vlad the Impaler. How he ruled his country and things that he did, and you could pattern your government after that. You may not, it's sort of your take on how bad that type of government, that repressive of a government would be. If you're playing in a game like some of the vampire games where, say, they get into power and they are manipulation and they're trying, all of that type of stuff, that's politics. And how is that influencing your game? So for those people who say, oh, I don't want politics in my game, you've got them in your almost all role-playing games. Actually, I'd like to find some examples of games that really don't have any government, even if you don't have a government, you have interaction between people. So I guess if you're just interacting with robots and that they're a nice state, but you could almost argue that gets into weird, there might be some weird cyberpunk things like that. Or if you're only out fighting, Gamma World may be one where there is you're totally on your own trying to reestablish the world. That one would be an example where I wouldn't find much politics, because all you're doing is trying to establish your foothold in the world. But then as your settlement grows, there would be some sort of politics about who's the leader and so on. So tell me about your thoughts on this. Do you think that I'm wrong? There are games with no politics in them? What have you done with politics in yours? Do you take a look at the article, the video? I'll put the link down that inspired me to do this one. But I'd like to hear your comments. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. I appreciate all your comments. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give me a thumbs down. I appreciate both forms of feedback. If you're new here and would like to subscribe, you can click on the icon on the left. If you're interested, there's more content on the right.